So today we're going to talk a little bit about MVPs. I've done some searching on the internet and it looks like there's some mixed feelings about the topic. Some people absolutely love them, other people have raised some concerns. And so I was going to talk about how I personally view MVPs and how I actually find them useful. So, first of all, what is an MVP not? Well, if you are trying to cram every feature in there and deciding, oh, this is MVP, so I am going to use the messiest code later because I'm just going to come back and clean this up, that's not an MVP. That is rushing through to create a product and cutting corners. And ultimately, you're just going to end up with a mess that's never going to get cleaned up. Or if you have an idea, you're not really sure, you haven't fully designed it, maybe you have decided on a set of features and you're not sure that the user even needs those features, that's not really an MVP either. That could be a proof of concept. Maybe you have an idea, you want to see if you can make it work, you write a few lines of code. You're not really concerned about the quality. You just want to test out an idea. That's not an MVP. So, what is an MVP? And why would we even want to bother with that? Well, we have to look at the minimal viable product. That's what the acronym stands for. And think about what those words really mean. So, that middle word there, viable, that's pretty key. Is it really viable if it's missing features that your users absolutely need? No. Is it viable if it is full of bugs? No. And so, what we're looking for when we're building an MVP is something that is simple but solid. When we look at it, it should have all of the necessary features that will be create a useful product for your user, which means first of all, you have to understand your user. You need to know understand the industry that your users are in. You need to understand what kind of problems that they're facing and what problem are you wanting to solve with this product. And you want to make sure that the problem you're trying to solve is one that they want solved. Because if they have 10 different problems and you pick a problem that you have a great idea for, but they actually don't care as much about that one, then your product isn't really going to serve them. So the first step would be understand your users, know what they really need before proceeding with your MVP. And then once you understand them, make sure you're not trying to solve too many problems at once. Because the whole idea of an MVP is getting something to the users very quickly so that they can start using and benefiting from the software sooner rather than later. And this is great because you're going to get feedback, you're going to understand even more how your users use your product. And beyond that, it's going to give you time to maybe then start looking at some of the other problems and how you might solve those problems with your software. But at the same time, the MVP needs to be very focused. So find out what matters to your user, what challenges are they facing. They likely have some sort of workaround that they're using, but it's not really meeting their needs. So find out why they're struggling and focus on the problem first before you start generating solutions. Because that's the only way to really know and understand what it is that needs to be fixed and how you're going to fix it in the simplest way possible. One way to think about this is if you meet some people that maybe need some transportation and they all they need is to get from point A to point B. And you find out, okay, they want to have windows, they want to have working TVs in the vehicle, they want to have an air conditioner, They want luxury seats. They want a gaming system and so on. We're looking at this product and you're saying, well, okay, I can do this, but it's going to cost X amount of money and it's going to it's going to take Z amount of time. And the user is like, well, we have an event that we need to get to in 2 months and you can't deliver it within that time. So when you look at the problem, what is the problem the user wants to solve? They're trying to get a certain amount of people to an event in 2 months, a relatively short time frame. And so you take a step back and you might say, well, we can't add the TVs or the gaming system or many of the features that you requested, but we can give you something that will get you from point A to point B. We'll handle the amount of people that you need to transport, and we can get it done in 2 months. That's the concept of the MVP. And that's really how I use it. I worked on a project where there were many items that were called out by some beta testers, and the deadline was set. It couldn't be moved. And I knew that in order to reach that deadline, there was no way to do every single one of these features. So it was a matter of prioritizing. Prioritize, triage, solve the actual problem that needs to be solved. And then you can come back to the other things later. Because once the problem is solved, users are happy. Likely, they will enjoy the other features. It will make your product even better. But if they have a problem that needs to be solved by a certain time, then you do need to simplify down to just the essentials. And by just the essentials, does that mean that you cut corners in your quality? No, because if you have all the essential features and maybe a few more, but the product is extremely buggy and users can't actually use it, then you've accomplished nothing. So even though we're looking at developing a product very quickly, maybe it's a very restricted timeline, whatever we're able to develop in that timeline needs to be solid. So we want to make sure it's thoroughly tested. We want to make sure that the code is clean and maintainable, or as clean as possible and maintainable. We want to be thinking about the overall structure of the product as we're building it, and even keep in mind some of those future features, because that can influence how you even design your MVP. You're focusing just on the core features, but having some sort of understanding of what comes next can help you to have a better design that's not going to need a bunch of rework once you come back and start adding more features. Now, one thing that can present kind of an interesting situation is when you jump into an already existing code base and you're trying to deliver a product in this MVP style, and you realize that the existing code base, maybe it's not bad, but it's not perfect. It could be very tempting at that point to try to make it perfect. And that, depending on the number of features and the amount of time that you have, that might or might not be an option. If you have very few features, you have plenty of time, that might be the time to say, okay, I'm going to redesign this whole structure so that the code will be clean, and we will start with a very nice foundation so that we can have these core features really strong, really solid. And later, when we come back to build more, it will be a whole lot easier to add these new features to an already sturdy structure. But sometimes that's not an option. Sometimes you have to settle with making small code improvements that facilitate whatever feature you're currently working on and sacrifice some of the other things in order to meet that deadline. So there is some balance there. I am definitely not advocating rushing through and cutting corners, but sometimes you can't do as thorough of a cleanup as you want. But the principle of always leaving the code base better than when you started is always a good thing. It's always useful. And one thing that I've noticed is if I'm adding a feature or I'm changing a feature and I'm looking at this code and I'm realizing, okay, the code that I'm working with is duplicated. It's over here, and it's over here. Well, it makes sense at that point that I can just create a separate method and call that method in all three of those places as my first step. And then I can come and add the changes, maybe the new feature, the bug fix, whatever it is that's needed. And in that way, I haven't redesigned the entire code base, but I'm taking a step in the right direction towards having that cleaner architecture. And that's going to really help you to have a more solid code base rather than just accepting a messy MVP. And so when we look at it from that perspective, we're very focused, but we're not sacrificing quality, but we are balancing that with reasonableness and aware of the any deadlines that might be there. And so it's kind of an interesting problem to work with, building an MVP, depending on all the variety of circumstances that you could be facing, whether you have a relatively short timeline, maybe a little more wiggle room, maybe you have an existing code base, or you're starting from scratch. Ideally, you can start from scratch because then you can make sure that good quality code is right there from the beginning. And so then what's next? So you have your MVP, it's launched, users are happy, hopefully. You can go from there. Make sure you're paying attention to the feedback, and that feedback can help you to reprioritize and find out, okay, what is the next highest on the list? What is the next most important thing that this application needs? That way, instead of just adding features that you think are best or you think are a good idea, you're really letting the user's needs drive what's being built. And that's really going to make sure that what you deliver is something that they actually want, that actually solves real world problems that they need to be solved. And so, even though it could be more fun to work on this more interesting feature over here, it's really having that focus on what the user needs is what's going to help us to have not just a successful MVP, but also a successful project going forward, where that project, that software is going to grow, features are going to get added, and it's going to stay a stable, sturdy code base that is focused on the user and that is focused around meeting their needs, and will be in a better position to be maintained, to be updated, and that's how you end up with really good software. And at some point, you might get into the place where now you do have that flexibility and that wiggle room. If you started out in an existing code base and couldn't make all of the necessary structure changes at the beginning, you could end up in a place where, okay, now I can go back in there and I can fix a few more things, make this a more stable product, because I know very soon we're going to start adding a bunch of features, and keeping those new features in mind, I know that making these specific changes will make those additions more reliable, less buggy, and a whole lot easier and quicker to implement. So those are some of the things that I think about when I'm thinking about an MVP. And I do think that it's a useful concept. I do think that it can be misused. I think people can get the wrong idea about it, that they can look at it as an excuse to cut corners. And I don't think that's the correct use of an MVP. I think quality still matters, but the MVP does help you to focus on the user. It does help you to deliver something they actually need, and it does keep open the idea of a product that can keep growing if the need arises. So my advice is just focus on the user and don't sacrifice the quality. Thanks.